So thank you everyone for coming today in person and online. This is a truly remarkable turnout, and I think just testament to Maud Lewis's legacy and her ability to continue to delight and to attract all sorts of viewers. So this exhibition was organized by the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, which is in Kleinburg, Ontario, near Toronto. And it was curated by their chief curator, Sarah Milroy. So I'm here, the project manager, the one who oversaw its installation. And this show has been traveling across the country for about 2 years. And it brings together nearly 140 paintings by the iconic East Coast painter Maud Lewis. So it is a really amazing opportunity to see so much of her work together, to see how her practice progressed over time. And here in the West, it's really nice to see so many of her paintings because as we know, a lot of her work is still in the East Coast in Nova Scotia. So just let's see here. How many people have seen this show already? Just a few, okay, nice. How many people have never seen Maud Lewis's work? Okay, a few, okay. So hopefully this will be lots of information for those of you unfamiliar with her practice, and for those of you who are familiar, I hope you learned something too. Just one last show of hands. Who here has seen the film Maudie? Okay, lots of people, okay. So that's great. So if you've seen the Hollywood film, or if you're a little bit familiar with Maud Lewis's practice, you probably know a little bit about her story, particularly some of the hardships that she endured in her life, such as the chronic pain because of her arthritis, or the difficulties in her marriage. But this show focuses less on sort of her background and those elements, and more on the art and the practice, Maud Lewis as an artist. So we have a lot of paintings brought together that really showcase where she started and how she progressed. The show is organized to highlight the serial repetition in her work. So it is organized around some of the most common themes we find in Maud Lewis's paintings, including animals or the sea, the harbor, modes of transportation such as carts, carriages, trains, etc. And this both highlights the themes that were of most interest to Maud Lewis that she was painting, but also what she was selling to her customers. One thing I want you to pay attention to as we move through the show is there will be a lot of paintings clustered together that all look similar, but no two are ever exactly the same. While there might be the same cats in several paintings, she's always changing the season or changing some of the decorative elements in the image. So pay attention to that as we move throughout the show. So we're gonna go in here. Maud Lewis's works are not that big, and so it is going to be hard for everyone to see at one time. But as we move around, try to take a look at what I've talked about and sort of take turns. I want to focus on first, the first painting in the show and the large photographic mural that you can probably see through the doorway. I realize we're going to create a little bit of a bottleneck in the entrance, so we're going to try to spread out a little. As you walk in, take a look at those two things, and that's where we're going to start. Okay. Okay, I think we have everyone. So I want to start by looking at this painting behind a few of you here. This is one of the many paintings for sale signs that Maud Lewis would have created to put on the outside of her house. It's a bit unique for her work because it's on a black background. We will see a few other examples of that, but it's not generally something she was doing. But the effect here is that it makes for a quite graphic image. And of course, the white and the yellow and the other colors really pop against that background to attract visitors. So she lived on the side of a main road in Digby County, Nova Scotia. And Maud Lewis really did work for a market. So she didn't attend art school. She didn't really participate in a greater sort of art world at the time. She didn't exhibit in galleries at the time or have a sort of community of artists. But she sold her paintings from the side of the road from her house. So mostly this was to locals, so to people who might have been driving by, visiting perhaps from Halifax, or to a lot of American tourists who were coming up from the Eastern United States into the Maritimes. They were often buying her work as well. So this really does set up the context for the show, the fact that Maud Lewis for her livelihood and selling her works of art. Just beside this work, we have this amazing enlarged photographic mural. So as I mentioned, for most of her career, she was selling to those who were visiting her house. But around 1965, she was the subject of two major features. So one was a documentary by CBC, and you can look that up and watch it on some of the only footage of Maud Lewis actually working and talking about her work. And then this photograph was taken for an article in a Toronto publication in 1965. So this is only 5 years before her death. And some of the only sort of footage we have of Maud Lewis or documentary imagery. And this is the house I'm referring to. So you see a little bit of it there. The house was, if you've seen, 12.5 by 13.5 feet. It wasn't very big. And she, as you can tell, painted the outside of it. So the door and the windows. And this would, again, be a kind of other marketing tool. So people would be attracted to this bright and colorful house. But she also painted the entire interior. So all the walls, the furniture, like the stove and other items like the bread box. Which suggests to us too that she was painting the life around her to bring joy and comfort to her own setting and house. And so I like to think of the house as the kind of one work that Maud Lewis made for herself, the one work that wasn't for sale, but was her own sort of piece. So in 1965, she came to a lot of national attention because of these two features. And she started selling her work to people across the country as well. So some people might send her a letter in the mail and $5. She always sold her paintings for $5 usually. And then she would mail off something like this. And at this height of popularity, she was actually painting 2 to 3 paintings a day. So you can imagine she was selling quite a bit. Actually, I'm curious if anyone here happens to have a Maud Lewis in their own collection. No. Sometimes there's someone, often if you're from the East Coast, that has inherited one. I met someone the other day, she inherited it because it was in her grandmother's kitchen. So I'll just mention a little bit about the house as well. So as I said, it was quite small. And after her death and then her husband's death, some years later, it really fell into disrepair. But there was a big effort by the local community and the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia to save and conserve, to restore the house. So for those of you who have visited Halifax, the house is on permanent display in their gallery. But for those of us who don't have the privilege to go there, there is a really amazing virtual tour online. And you can get right into the house and click on little elements and see blown up images. And you can read about the pretty amazing, I think, 10-year conservation efforts. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So this exhibition begins not with one of these themed sections, but with paintings from her earliest days. So from around the 1940s and early 1950s. We are going to, let's all kind of turn around. We're going to look at the very first painting on the wall. Okay, so this is one of the very earliest pieces in the show. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Maud Lewis, or maybe you've seen a reproduction of the cats before, this doesn't really look like that. So this is, one of her earlier experiments, I would say. And the tone is a little bit darker than what we're used to. A part of that is because in her early days, she was using found materials. So her husband was cutting boards for her from scrap, and she was using paint that they could find. And oftentimes that might have been house paint or boat paint because of the industry of fishing and boating where she lived. And while she didn't attend art school, as I mentioned, she would have still been finding inspiration in other imagery, so particularly popular media. So I'm thinking calendars, wall calendars with images, or magazines, or this one really has a postcard-like aesthetic to it. And it's a little bit more detailed too than what we might expect from some of her other imagery. So we have this very clear foreground with the girl jumping into the lake, the midground, and the background of the trees and the mountains. And it also seems a little bit generic. We don't know quite where it is. So here in the West, it kind of looks like a Rocky Mountain picture. So it might have been a scene she was familiar with, but it was likely something she would have seen and then copied and made her own. Let's move a little bit down, and I'll tell you a little bit about Maud Lewis's upbringing, and we'll look at some more early pictures while I do. These are two that you were just looking at, nice examples. You can tell the paint has deteriorated a little bit more than a lot of the other works in this show, and that is because of some of those unstable materials she was using before she had got her hand on specific paints. So Maud Lewis was born, Maud Dowley was her maiden name, in 1903 in a rural area near Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And she was born into a really loving family with her parents and her brother, and they supported her interest in the arts. So particularly, she liked to play the piano and to draw and paint. Her father was a blacksmith and a harness maker. And this is an important detail because in her later years when she's painting, she's often painting nostalgic images. And you'll see oxen or carts or blacksmith and leather making elements that she would have been familiar with from her father. In her youth too, her and her mother would draw and paint Christmas cards, and then they would sell these door to door in their community, just as other people might sell canned goods or jam, etc. So that was really how she started making art, and we're actually going to see some examples of that in a few minutes. She was born with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And so in her teenage years, this really started to affect her spine and her hands in particular. And it also made it difficult for her to seek work outside of the home. So she continued to live with her parents into adulthood. She did do some schooling. She went up to about grade 5 in her early teenage years. And then in her early 30s, both of her parents passed away. And she was left in a bit of a difficult position without much of a social safety net. So seeking to sort of advance her position, she answered an ad by a local man, and his name was Everett Lewis. And he was looking for a live-in housekeeper. Now you can imagine that was his house. It was 12.5 by 13.5 feet, but he wanted someone to live there and to clean and to cook. He was an unmarried man. So she answered the ad. She walked, I think, 10 kilometers to get there. And he hired her, but she didn't want to move in without being married. And so after a brief courtship, the two of them got married in 1938. And she moved in, and that's where she lived and sold her paintings until her death in 1970. So I just want to mention a few other of some of these early paintings. We can tell, as I said, some of the deteriorating paint, but also some interesting elements that may have been both a product of her imagination, but also the fact that she was using whatever was available to her. So she might have not have had a wide range of colors, for example. So in this harbor image, the water and the sky are the exact same color of turquoise. And in this one here, the sky is yellow. So maybe not what we would typically think of. This wall too shows us some of the subject matter that she's interested in that then she's going to start repeating as she matures towards that kind of iconic style we know her for. Also, she lived her entire life in between Yarmouth and Digby County, which is only about 100 kilometers away, and she didn't do much traveling. So she painted the world she knew. And I just want to mention this one because this is something I learned about this week, not being, being from Alberta and not very familiar with fishing or the ocean. This is called drying cod flakes. So when I initially read that, I thought the flakes refer to the fish. Is anyone here from the East Coast? Does anyone know what a flake is? Can you describe it? Yeah, that you dry fish on.
Scrap wood or like bark, obviously, on the trees, like twigs or some brush, and it was a wood structure that was used to lay the fish out after the fish has been filleted.
Yeah.
Not salt, but table salt is curing salt.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the structure that is most typical would be kind of like an A-frame, I think, and air could flow underneath, and after the fish have been salted, they're drying. This is a more temporary structure that I think if you have an abundance of fish, they would have built these. And they're just as wide as someone can kind of reach across. So you'll see there's only 2 rows of fish. And these are a lot of the kind of nostalgic elements that Maud Lewis is incorporating in her paintings. So this is the sort of introductory section, and we'll move to the first thematic section of the show, which is all about animals. So we'll go look at some of the cats. Okay, so these paintings are understandably so some of the fan favorites. So I will say, when Maud Lewis married Everett, he was a fish peddler. So he would go door to door selling fish. And she started making her cards again and would join him and would sell them. And people started to really take an interest in those cards. I think they were sold for about 5 cents a piece. And after that, she started working on a slightly larger scale. So these could fetch a little bit more money. And as it became more difficult for her to work on a small scale with her hands, with the arthritis, working on a larger scale became a little bit easier. And so these are some examples of work from the late 50s and early 60s. We never know the exact date, but we can tell by how they look usually. And you can see she's really developing the sort of her signature style and the motifs that she incorporates. So unlike that very first image we looked at of the lake that kind of had this foreground, midground, and background and was quite detailed, here Lewis is really flattening the image. So we don't have that sense of receding space. Everything's kind of brought up to the picture plane. And it makes for a really kind of graphic and poppy image, something that would really attract people to buy. She's also developing this sort of economy of strokes. So these elements that she's always using. So these bright yellow circles for the eyes. The tulips, which we'll see a lot, are usually just 2 or 3 dashes of color. And there's always this lovely framing element of the trees, in this case of all the apple. So they sort of frame that central figure. And as I mentioned, she's starting to paint the same thing over and over again, but there's always differences between them. In her very later years, when it became more difficult to paint, she would actually use some stencils that her husband Everett would help her. So then she might stencil in the central image and then paint the rest of it behind. And this is both because of the faculty in her hands, but also remember she was selling 2 to 3 paintings a day in the height of her career in the mid-60s. So this becomes a method of producing more. And this wall, I just want to mention, so we see a lot of farm animals, which reference her upbringing, but this is one of the sort of iconic Maud Lewis flourishes, is the blossoming spruce trees. Of course, we know spruce don't have beautiful, bright pink flowers, but this is something she always did. And then we'll just look at the oxen. I was thinking this morning as I was walking my dog in the fresh snow that back in February when it was really cold and we were installing the show, I was really excited that the run of this exhibition was going to coincide with spring. And of course, on the spring equinox last week, we had a big snowstorm, but then this week it was +20 and then we had more snow today, which perhaps is actually most fitting because Maud Lewis was painting all the seasons. And sometimes we'll notice that she was actually mixing the seasons up a little bit. So you might see really bright pink or orange in some of the winter scenes, which we might not expect. So similar to the cats that are posed kind of like a portrait, these are the pairs of oxen. Now, sometimes she was painting, we'll see later, oxen that were working, so maybe pulling logs, but these are in a sort of more portrait format. They have a specific yoke style, an East Coast, pardon me, yoke style that connects them by the back. And it's a beautiful and decorative yoke style if you look at pictures of it online. And so this would have been something she was familiar with from her father, who was making things like this. Again, we have this beautiful framing element of the trees or the blossoms. And so this is one, we have, I think, 8 on display here, but you can always see there are different seasons or different elements to the setting. So she's constantly combining and recombining the elements of the picture to create the composition. Now I want to move into the back room here, and we'll take a look at some harbor scenes. And I should mention in, I think 2020, I have the date here. Yeah, in 2020, the oxen were on a postage stamp. So you might have seen the Canadian postage stamp. And of course, the one last sort of Maud Lewis flourish is the long eyelashes, which some attribute to Maud Lewis's sense of humor, but also oxen and cows, if you look up close, they have beautiful eyelashes. So I think that is staying true to the beauty of the oxen. So we'll room here. So this section of the show is called By the Seaside. It's all images, of course, of the sea. So as Maud Lewis's career is progressing into the 50s and 60s, she's turning away from copying any imagery or referring to images she might have seen in magazines and calendars, and developing the subject matter of most interest to her. Always painting the world around her, so exactly what she knew and saw. And she's, of course, very familiar with the area of Nova Scotia, so you'll see how she is painting the high wharf, extreme changes in tide, or the mud flats at low tide. And she's often was creating a really nostalgic image of the East Coast, referring back to her youth. And so you will see references to fishing or farming culture that probably weren't so popular in the 1950s and 60s when we have technology and automation and other machinery kind of taking place. But she's often referring back to them. And this would, of course, been popular to her clientele and continues to be popular today. And I think it's these images in particular that really contribute to the sort of icon of Maud Lewis as a sort of image of the East Coast. And this kind of imagery continues to be sort of the marketing, the touristic image of the area. What I want to focus on in this room is the way that Maud Lewis builds a scene or a composition, how she really expertly used color and shape to draw our eye in and move around the scene. So this one in particular, it's a quite maybe simple looking image. There aren't a ton of colors. There's mostly red, white, black, blue for the water. But she's using repetitive elements to draw our eye in. So of course, we're immediately drawn to the central image of the lighthouse and the red and white building. But then it's repeated here in the boat, and then here in the birds, and then again in the background. So she creates this meandering path through the image using color and shape. And oftentimes we'll have the masts of the boat or the wings of the birds sort of moving in the same direction to create this sense of movement or sort of waves throughout the picture. In the back corner there, these images I really love for the color, the striped fish barrels, the lobster traps. So you'll notice that the colors are becoming a lot brighter, kind of punchier. And this is because as she's selling, she is gaining access to better materials. Around 1965, when that feature in Toronto happened, she also came to the recognition of some other artists around the country. Particularly, there was an artist in Ontario who started mailing her pre-cut panels. So you'll see that the paintings become a little bit more uniform in their shape. and artist quality oil paints. And oftentimes she was working directly from the tube or putting the paint into like old sardine cans and not mixing them on a palette. So we have these really bright and bold colors that are quite different from the earlier work we saw. I just want to also kind of give a shout out to our education department. So we created this kind of small Maud Lewis playhouse, but it was activated on 2 Sundays. We have something here called All Day Sunday, where people and families can come and experience the shows, but also do some hands-on activities. And so I think we had over 50 people inspired to paint the house. So that's there. And then we have this card making station as a nod to Maud Lewis's earliest work. And people can create their own postcard and leave it here or take it home with them to send. And we've been seeing some really amazing cards made there. So we're going to take a little bit of a walk in around the corner. And I want to look at another animal image and some of the Christmas scenery. Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to quickly point out the deer paintings because so this was another common motif of Maud Lewis's, is the 2 deer, sometimes a stag and doe or a doe and fawn, like the cats where we have the mother and the kittens. But this one in particular, I really love the sense of the scene. So like the oxen and the cat where we have that framing device, Maud Lewis is taking it kind of a step further here. And so we have the trees that frame the scene, but it's almost like a stage is set up. And so we have the 2 deer facing away from us and into this quaint village, almost as if they are characters on the stage, or actually they're mimicking our viewing position. And this was, I think, common for Maud Lewis to, surrounded by animals growing up and loving them, to often paint these harmonious images of animals and people or nature and culture. And these are all winter scenes which relate to everything behind us, which is all about Christmas. So we have a bunch of Maud Lewis Christmas cards. They're quite small, so I encourage you to kind of walk around and take a look at them. These are not from her earliest days as a child. I don't know if those exist. I imagine they might be somewhere, but they'd probably be hard to track down. These are more from the early 1940s when she was making the cards with her husband and selling them door to door. I'll just mention, this is a clip from the film Maudie from 2017. It is a Hollywood depiction. This is about 5 minutes long. We've just turned down the sound for the sake of the tour. But this shows Maud and Everett in their early sort of years together when he is selling fish and she is trying to sell her cards. And they have one customer who's taken a real liking to them and ordered her to make a bunch more and is offering her more money. So it nicely relates to the Christmas cards we're about to look at. So the Christmas cards in particular really show a range of Maud Lewis's style and material. So the early ones, she's using ink and watercolor and inscribing them in the sort of beautiful penmanship she would have learned in school. And later she's using gouache. Sometimes there's these elements too, like this one in the middle here with a bow. Now, I don't know if that was added by the person who bought the card or sent the card, or if Maud Lewis did that, but it's a really nice element. We also, again, see Maud Lewis's sense of humor in some of the cards. So over on that wall, we have a group of children skating and one has fallen on their bum. And I gave a tour the other day and someone pointed out that all of the cards related to Christmas are all about sort of fun winter themes, and we don't see any religious elements in the cards. And I don't quite know why or the context, but I think that was a really interesting observation. So you'll notice that as you go through. Kind of the feature of this room, though, are these amazing window shutters. So these are the other works we have here painted on black. And particularly the white and the red really pop on these black backgrounds. So sometimes Maud Lewis did commissions, and this is an example of that. This is the largest commission she did, both in terms of how many paintings, but also the size. She didn't usually paint vertically, so this is a bit unique. And also Maud Lewis was a quite small woman, so these would have been a pretty large scale work for her to paint. So there was a family in the area, an American family, who had a vacation home, and they asked Maud to paint 2 sets of shutters. We'll see the others in a moment, one set for summer and one set for winter. So here we have a lot of Christmas themes of the snowmen and the candy cane, but also some of the whimsical elements that Lewis added, like the yellow and pink butterflies, which we wouldn't, winter. But I also want to point out that one, which is quite incredible. So we have this rotund snowman, his stogie, his argyle socks, the bright red lobster ready for a holiday meal. But he's holding a tray of drinks, cups, and the bottle in the center says TNT. So I think this is Maud Lewis's warning about the risks of overconsumption at the holiday season. And we don't see too much of that in her paintings, this sort of maybe moral element or critique, societal critique. So I quite like that one. These paintings have undergone some major conservation work, but they are in pretty incredible shape for something that would have been handled frequently and exhibited outside for so long. One other thing we have in this room, which is kind of special, is here. This is another early one. We don't actually know the date, but it's painted on a cake pan. So painting Christmas cards, she was also sometimes painting these functional objects, which is a real folk art tradition. And at one point, there was a woman who owned a beauty shop in Yarmouth, and she would sell her and her mother's cards and some of these other painted wares. So that's the only example we have in the show. And of course, she would have done this in her own home. Okay, so this section of the show is called From Here to There. So it is all about getting from one place to another, whether that is by carriage, horse-drawn carriage. We also see some carts that farmers are using. We see some cars and some trains. We have images of the carriage. And again, these are quite a nostalgic image. Oftentimes it's children going to a one-room schoolhouse, for example. But I do, again, want to point out the way that Maud Lewis is building this composition. So we always have the carriage that immediately draws our eye in, and then the covered bridge, and then back to this village. So again, this kind of sweeping sense of movement. The village, however, is usually at the base of a hill or some trees, so that kind of flattens space rather than receding forever. And that is common in Maud Lewis's paintings. What is really nice about a lot of these, though, is that we have this sense of a heightened point of view, a little bit above the image. And so it's almost as if we are in a carriage too, kind of barreling in behind them down this hill and into the scene. I quite like too how Maud Lewis in this one, for example, she just parts the trees a little bit so you can see that orange house. So there's always this focus on the repetition of these bright colors throughout the scene. Now I want to look at this painting in the corner. I'm going to use my notes here so I don't forget the details. So this is a really in the show because it's an early work from about 1949 or 1950. It is a depiction of a historical scene and of something happening in the US. So unlike everything else we see where Maud Lewis is really only painting what she sees and knows in the world around her, this is neither of those things. So I'm led to believe that it could have been a commission, or I suspect something that she painted because she read about this moment in history, maybe in a magazine or a newspaper. So the date, May 14th, 1851, is inscribed right on the painting, which gives us a hint to what is going on. And then the train says Erie. So this is the Erie train. The Erie Railroad at one time was the longest in the world. Construction began in 1835, and it connected the Hudson River near New York City to the west shore of Lake Erie at Dunkirk. So it was 450 miles. It was completed in May, and on the inaugural trip from one place to the other, the president of the time, President Fillmore, and members of his cabinet rode the train. And the report goes that he sat outside on this flat deck for the 2-day journey and had this blanket or steamer rug on his lap and a jug of rum. The only thing that is missing is that jug of rum in the painting. At least I haven't seen it. So this is a historical scene, but of course, Maud Lewis was also including some of her characteristic elements. So we have all the tulips and the blossoming tree again. And then I want to point out these cars. There's only 2 cars in the show, and I really love these images. So this is a Model T Ford. Now the couple in the car are, painted too generically to determine if it's a self-portrait, but Everett did have a Model T briefly in the beginning of their marriage, and they would ride around when he was selling fish. Eventually, he got a different occupation and sold the car. So I imagine that this is a kind of memory of that time and the freedom of traveling around by car. Maud and Everett lived in that small house until her death. They had no running water, no electricity. So you can imagine the kind of luxury that this car would have been. And of course, I love that she lines these sort of back roads of the county with these bright blossoming tulips. So we have here the complementary shutters to the winter ones. So these are the summer shutters, painted with big bouquets, and birds. And then we have some other summer themed paintings. And this one in particular is quite sweet. This is, however, quite unlike a lot of the other imagery we saw, and it's the only one in the exhibition. Maybe the butterflies are sort of similar, but it's a really quite flat image. There's no sense of space or depth and it almost has this wallpaper-like quality, like you could imagine it being repeated and put on a wall. The black cap on the goldfinches indicates that they're male goldfinches. And this is likely a kind of scene that she might have seen in her own yard, for example. So while this isn't maybe typical of the imagery that she was selling a lot of or painting a lot, it has become a quite reproduced and iconic image of Maud Lewis's, and is similar to what she was painting on her house. So if you go look at the house again at the front, you'll see she was often adding sort of birds and flowers to her walls and windows. So that brings us to the end of the tour. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. I hope you've learned a little bit about Maud Lewis and her work. And thank you again for joining.